Good morning. I'm Leila Abed, the Mexico Institute Director, and it is my pleasure to welcome everybody this morning to the Wilson Center. As many of you know, the bilateral relationship between the United States and Mexico is broad and deep, and it's bound by geographical, historical, cultural, and commercial ties that span over 200 years of diplomatic relations. Every 12 years, presidential elections in the United States and Mexico coincide, and they provide an opportunity to analyze past and current efforts and propose public policy options to the new governments to enhance the bilateral relationship. At such a critical juncture in the U.S.-Mexico relationship, the Wilson Center's Mexico Institute prepared a booklet to delve deeper into fundamental issues on the bilateral agenda and propose recommendations to the next president of the United States on ways to better engage with Mexico. The booklet includes sections on security, USMCA implementation and the upcoming 2026 review process, migration, energy, cross-border water management, and democracy. In December 2023, many of you may recall, the Mexico Institute published a very similar booklet geared toward Mexico's incoming president with recommendations on how to strengthen its relationship with its top trading partner. Both booklets offer an overview of the topics followed by recommendations at the end of each section. As you know, these are very, very highly complex topics, but the objective is to provide a concise analysis, which means that some aspects or elements of the selected sections could not be covered for questions of brevity. Given the evolving political landscape in the U.S. and Mexico, the authors will have the ability to periodically update their sections on the electronic version of this booklet. For brevity, multiple issues on the bilateral agenda were also not included in this booklet, despite their importance. The Mexico Institute will explore these and other matters throughout its ongoing programming. Several of the booklet's authors are here with us today to discuss their sections and provide insight on what to expect from the new U.S. administration and how it can strengthen bilateral relations with Mexico. But before we begin, let me cover a couple of housekeeping items. There are printed booklets for outside the auditorium for our in-person guests, and our virtual viewers can access the electronic version on the Mexico Institute website. You can download it. It's on our landing page, also under our publication section. We do have a Spanish translation available of the booklet. It will be uploaded to our website in the next 2 hours. Towards the end of the conversation today, we will take questions from the audience. In-person guests can, of course, just raise their hand and a microphone will be brought to you. But for those of you joining us online, if you would like to submit a question to our panelists, please send them to our X account at Mexico Institute or to our email, mexico@wilsoncenter.org. Finally, I want to thank our authors for sharing their knowledge and their insight on key areas of the U.S.-Mexico bilateral agenda. We couldn't have done this booklet, nor could we have done such a great job at explaining very complex issues in such a short format without your expertise and help. So thank you to each and every one of you. I also want to recognize Mexico Institute staff members Virginia Bullington and Maria Calderon for their hard work in making this booklet a success. I keep saying that a lot of what we do at the Mexico Institute could not be done without the great team that I have and that I have the honor to lead. So thank you not only to Virginia and to Maria, but also to the interns and to everybody that helps us each and every day. And with that, we will begin with discussion. I am going to moderate, so I'm just going to switch over to my seat. We are joined by most of our authors. There are some missing. Vanda Felbaugh-Brown, unfortunately, cannot be here today, and I know security is an incredibly pressing issue for the next U.S. administration and for the U.S.-Mexico relationship. So Ambassador Wayne and I will try to do our best to try to explain some of the main points that Vanda proposes and that she covers in her chapter, as well as the democracy chapter. So we will be covering those today as well, Ambassador. But for the other sections, we do have one or both authors. I'm going to quickly give their current titles. And if you would like to know more about their background, you can find their full bios on the Mexico Institute website. So joining us online is Rosario Sanchez. She's the Senior Research Scientist at the Texas Water Resource Institute. So welcome, Rosario. David Goldwyn. He's the President of Goldwyn Global Strategies. Diego Marroquin is our Burson Foster North America Scholar. He's our inaugural Burson Foster Scholar. He's working on all issues USMCA related. I'm sure a lot of you have come across many of his publication and great work that he does with us. Of course, Ambassador Tony Wayne doesn't need any introduction at all, but he is the former U.S. Ambassador to Mexico. But perhaps more importantly, he's the co-chair of the Mexico Institute Advisory Board, which I am very grateful for. And joining us today is Julia Young. She's an associate professor at Catholic University. Ernesto Castañeda as well. He's a director of the Center for Latin America and for Latin American and Latino Studies, and founding director of the Immigration Lab, graduate program director at American University. So we really are very lucky to have all these authors joining us today. I know, Rosario, that you are going to have to leave a little bit early this morning, so I'm going to kick it off with you. If you can talk a little bit about what information, what research, what insight the water chapter provides, and talk a little bit about the importance of cross-border water management between the U.S. and Mexico. Thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you to the Institute for having us participate in this. My co-author, Gabriel Eckstein, is in another event right now that we are co-hosting, so we're kind of sharing ourselves to be here, but he wanted to be here too. So thank you for having us today and for letting us share a little bit of our experience and knowledge on water issues between Mexico and the U.S. and the border. And from the chapter quickly, because I know we have limited time, and it was very, very hard to put all the issues in this short and in a way that is understandable for policymakers, for different types of audience. But mainly, if you go through the chapter and see and read on inter the lines that we're saying, it's basically three things. First, that things have changed dramatically since 1990s. That doesn't mean the problems started in 1990s, but they become visual. And they are creating tension. And we have lessons that we can learn from on the different basins. Which basins? The Rio Grande and the Rio Colorado basins. We have two of the most water-stressed basins in the world, the Colorado River Basin and the Rio Grande Basin. We know that we have persistent drought conditions on both basins, and they are both overexhausted. We know the population growth will keep growing. We know the economic development of this region is incomparable, which means it will keep growing. So we know the expectations in population growth, and we know the expectation of economic growth, which will require water. The main issue here is the reliability of surface water is not there anymore for future growth. And what we are exploring here is the possibility of including or considering or exploring the possibility to include groundwater into the binational agenda discussion, which is not right now regulated or included or considered under the regulatory framework, which is the 1944 treaty between Mexico and the US. So apart from that, groundwater is becoming more strategic, is becoming more pressured. Right now, we estimate around 9 million people rely only on transboundary groundwater resources for domestic use and for future growth, especially in the state of Texas, which accounts for 60% of the border, by the way, and the land shared between Mexico and the US in terms of groundwater potential. We also know that with less surface water availability, the more the water quality challenges. The less the water, the less the quality, the more costly it becomes. So these are kind of the big picture that we're seeing right now on the border. We have a treaty that is shown to be very flexible. It has the adaptation capacity to adapt. We have adapted it 331 times, which are the 331 minutes that we have signed between both countries. still the challenges supersede the capacity of IBWC and actually the treaty to overcome, which is climate change, population growth, and inability of the systems to comply with what the treaty actually says. From both sides of the border, we know that in terms of water quality, at least 35% of water that is flowing on the Rio Grande, for example, is untreated. We've seen notices here in the border of boiling notices just for E. coli disruptions. We have over 1 million people not connected to city systems, city water systems that is completely reliant on groundwater, and you know groundwater is not really regulated under the federal government as far as just only water quality standards, but really they're not required by law to be monitored. So this is basically cities that rely on themselves for water quality. Cities, communities, and we're talking about 500,000 people just in Texas. And okay, so apart from water quality, the other important point here, and I'm just reading through the chapter as I speak, we do have important lessons learned from the Colorado River that could be adaptable to the Rio Grande River. For example, the non-definition of extraordinary drought, which has been successfully for one applied on the Colorado River, which has limited the reductions of water allocations for both countries, US and Mexico as well. And we have not been able to do that or to work towards that on the Rio Grande Basin. Still the contention is still the tension, and is still the much more that we need to do on this side of the country. Still, 3 weeks ago, there's a new minute, the minute 331, that was signed between both countries to improve reliability and predictability of water deliveries from Mexico to the US. It's very, it is an overall attempt to improve the compliance of Mexico with the treaty. However, from our perspective, mostly academic and scientific perspective, it doesn't address the main issue, which is the overall allocation. There's more water in paper than actually in the basin. And there's not going to be more water. It's not like we cannot invent or create more water for the needed growth. So for us, it's very, it really shows the trust, the commitment, and the willingness to make this work. But the main issue remains the overall allocation and the non-definition of what extraordinary drought means for the future predictability of the system. So and I'm going to cut it. I know that I can speak over this forever, and I'm not going to do that. But as far as our recommendations, and you can look at those, apply lessons learned from the Colorado River, which we have been able to cut, actually, to conserve water and for the environment as well. We have not been able to do that for the Rio Grande. The interpretation of extraordinary drought, what does this mean in terms of new conditions for the Rio Grande Basin? How to recognize environmental needs, because without the river, there's nothing actually that could survive around here without the benefits of the environmental services of the river. And of course, facilitate much more communication, trust building, capacity building, which, by the way, IBWC has been able to do that a lot lately. And there's a lot of efforts towards that, but still, there's a big difference between the two basins in terms of achievements on how to move forward with that, and the much more transparency and participation of stakeholders in the decision-making process, which is key, and it has been key for the other regions of the world. And of course, to strengthen IBWC's role by facilitating funding and allocation mechanisms. Right now, a lot of funding, a lot of support, a lot of attention, it's going to the Rio Grande, the Colorado River Basin, not much on the Rio Grande Basin. So with that, and of course to advocate, as I always do, to attend the issue of groundwater not being regulated, and especially the transboundary impacts of the most valuable resources that we have in the border. It's key for future growth. With that, I hope I made some sense, and I'll be around for a couple of minutes. I'm in the other session at the same time, so thank you.
Thank you so much, Rosario, and thank you again for being with us, even if it was for a short moment. If we have any questions regarding cross-border water management, since you won't be on, and since I am definitely not an expert on water management, I will make sure to send those to you, and then we can get those answers to any of the in-person guests or virtual guests, if that's okay with you, Rosario.
Of course, I'm open. Yes.
Thank
and
you
I'll
so
be
much.
Here for a couple.
Thank you. Thank you again, and thank you for your contribution to this booklet. We're going to move to energy. David, you are here as one of the co-authors of our energy chapter. Lourdes Melgar was the other author. Unfortunately, she cannot be here, but we are very well represented by David. And I think energy is perhaps one of the most important issues on the U.S.-Mexico relationship, but perhaps more importantly for the next U.S. president. And I was looking through your section, and it really does highlight sort of the need to boost Mexico's domestic energy supply and clean power to achieve sound economic growth. And of course, you and Lourdes point to some of the constitutional reforms in the energy sector that have affected the energy sector in Mexico and how those could potentially affect the USMCA. And I know we will talk about the USMCA and trade in North America more broadly in just a few moments, but could you walk us through some of the main points of the energy chapter and sort of offer some of the recommendations as well? Thank you, David.
Sure. Thanks, Leila. No, pleasure to do that and to be here with such excellent colleagues. And Lourdes and I have known each other for almost 30 years when she and I were both leading international energy policy, her and at the Energy Ministry, and me under President Clinton. And then when I did that again under Secretary Clinton, she and I were working on transboundary issues when she was at MIT. So sorry she can't be with us, but she's a remarkable individual and a great Mexican patriot. If we had the chance to talk to President Trump and talk to him about energy, I guess the first thing I would want to say to him is that we have an extremely interdependent relationship with Mexico on energy, which is a great source of prosperity and resilience and energy security for the United States. We export almost 6.8 billion cubic feet of gas per day to Mexico. That's a huge portion of the value of what Mexico needs, but it's also a tremendous source of prosperity for the United States. They are the #1 product export market, 1.2 million barrels a day in products. It's about 87% of our exports to Mexico, and we import about 733,000 barrels a day of crude, which goes to the Gulf Coast refineries, which make product, which we then sell to Mexico. So it's highly interdependent, it's highly profitable, and it's really important. So I would say that's not broke, and so we shouldn't do damage to it. The second thing I would say to him is that energy, as you pointed out, Leila, is really integral to Mexico's prosperity, and Mexico's prosperity is of national security importance to the United States. A prosperous Mexico, which generates economic growth and sufficient employment for its citizens, and an environment which can host companies which can supply goods to the United States, reduces migration pressure, reduces the power of the cartels, increases the amount of trade between the two countries because a wealthy Mexico buys an enormous amount of products from the United States, and without national income, they can't really do that. So this is really important to us. As I've discussed, it's also an extremely important export market. A little known fact maybe about the oil industry is, when you produce oil in the Permian, which the president is a big fan of President-elect is a fan of for energy dominance, it puts off a lot of gas. You have to have a place to put that gas, otherwise you flare it, which you can't really do. You have to sell it to somebody. And what do we do with that gas? We sell it to Mexico. Mexico's gas demand peaks, oil production gets shut in. So it's really important to energy dominance to be able to sell gas to Mexico. So we have an interest in the export market and as an import market. But for Mexico's prosperity, virtually their entire ability to host nearshoring, to be a place where companies want to invest, depends on their being able to generate more clean, firm, affordable power. And they can't do that without energy, and they can't do that without an appropriate investment framework. Which leads me to the second thing I would want to tell President-elect Trump, which is that Mexico's prosperity, and in fact the entire energy sector, is at tremendous risk because of the policies of President López Obrador and now President Sheinbaum. Mexico's energy policy over the years has been a roller coaster. They had years of underinvestment, basically because of a strongly nationalistic policy where Pemex, the national oil company, and CFE, the national electricity company, were undercapitalized, didn't have the technology. Things were declining. They had a world-class energy reform under President Peña Nieto, brought in billions of dollars in investment in renewables, oil, gas, Gulf of Mexico. But that was very unpopular with President López Obrador, who spent most of his term trying to undo it without success. But the landslide victory of Claudia Sheinbaum actually enabled President López Obrador to make constitutional changes to undo a significant amount of that reform. So today, the investment climate for energy in Mexico is poor. CFE and Pemex have resumed their roles as national champions. There's a cap on how much electricity a private sector can provide. Private sector companies can't build transmission. The independent regulators, which were formed under the energy reform, are becoming subsumed under the energy ministries. So your partner might also be your regulator, might also be your enforcer and your rule maker. That's really a not very attractive environment for people to operate in. The judicial reform, which we touched on a little bit, having all the judges elected means if you have to rely on local courts for dispute resolution and you don't have the benefit of external arbitration, independent arbitration, that's a very high risk. It's a high risk for a Mexican company. It's probably an unacceptable risk for a foreign investor. And so you've got a situation now where it's kind of unattractive to invest. And if this doesn't change, then we've probably seen the peak of gas transportation from the U.S. going into Mexico, because no one's going to want to build another gas pipeline. And so if Mexico is going to have to generate more electricity to try and host, where's the gas going to come from? Where's the capital going to come from? And if Mexico doesn't have the electricity, it doesn't get nearshoring. It doesn't get nearshoring, it doesn't get prosperity, and we've got a bigger migration problem. So this is a problem, I would say, to President-elect Trump that we need to fix. There's also a geopolitical risk, which is what happens if Western companies don't want to invest in Mexico? Who is interested in investing in Mexico? And so China is the first obvious answer, not always an economic investor, but how is the U.S. going to feel about infrastructure being built by Chinese companies who don't need necessarily that rate of return or will take the legal risk? There's also a Russia risk right now. It would be remarkable to know that RT, the Russian propaganda arm, which is not allowed to operate in the United States, broadcasts on the Mexican subway. So this new generation of Mexicans is getting a lot of information about their perspective of the United States from Russia. So we have an interest in making sure that U.S. companies, Western companies, continue to be interested in investing in Mexico. So with that, we have a few suggestions for what President-elect Trump ought to do in order to try and turn this around. First is we actually have to have a Mexico strategy. We have to both have the desire to and the intention to try and approach Mexico both multilaterally and bilaterally to engage on energy issues. We have to have a private conversation. I think especially with Mexico, it needs to be private. Ambassador Wayne knows this better than anyone else, but really to explain to them how we see this issue, which is that the current framework is a serious risk for investment and that it needs to be changed for Mexico's sake as well as for the United States. The things that need to be dealt with are independent regulation and rule of law and respect for contracts. And I think for this to happen, it has to be done at the head of state level. I don't think this is going to work ministry to ministry. We should revive our bilateral engagement on energy. We've had a U.S.-Mexico binational commission. Separate from USMCA, which is going to be kind of contentious, we can talk about a lot of things that President Sheinbaum is interested: nuclear, electric mobility, critical minerals, industrial safety, energy efficiency. We think we ought to revive the North American leadership process, the trilateral process with Canada. We actually will have a a paper coming out on that next week in an event here at the Wilson Center where we'll talk about that in more detail. But having Canada at the table creates a synergy. And a lot of that synergy is for cross-border investment, which is good for all three countries. I think the core message is that we need to encourage President Sheinbaum to take a more pragmatic approach to energy, one that is consistent with her ideology and with the ideology that Mexico is going to have national champions. Not that unusual. Saudi Aramco is a big national company, but they partner with the private sectors. They take in technology. They take in investment. So there are ways to do it, but this ought to be considered. I think as a gesture, the U.S. could approve all of the outstanding non-free trade agreement licenses to export gas, LNG, from Mexico through pipelines through Mexico. Some of those have been subject to the pause. I think that would be good for the U.S. exporters. It will be good for Mexico because essentially all of those projects include pipelines which transport gas to the coasts. But Mexico has the right to draw gas from those pipelines to feed some domestic use. And the last thing, I think, is probably a declaratory statement at the outset that whatever happens on tariffs and whatever happens with USMCA, that trade in commodities, oil, gas, electricity even, should be exempt from tariffs. I've stated at the beginning what the obvious self-interest of the United States is in this. It will be important for Mexico, but it'll be an important investment signal also. And so whatever happens, they ought to wall that piece of it off so that that trade can continue because it's in our interest more than theirs. So it's a big brief. To be honest, I am not certain how interested President-elect Trump will be in trying to make this kind of engagement with Mexico. But I think the education process that we have to do with them and that this booklet helps with is to explain how U.S. interests and even energy dominance are at risk and can be benefited by a positive relationship with Mexico. But for that to happen, things need to change in Mexico.
Thank you, David. Thank you so much for that incredible summary and really key recommendations. And I think that energy also, I mean, sort of outside the scope of this booklet, but energy security really is sort of a fundamental pillar as well for North America, right, and North American integration. So that's where Canada also comes naturally into the equation. So now that we're talking about North America, we have two of what I consider the best experts on USMCA, on trade and North American integration, and they're both part of the Mexico Institute, though I have to say I have to share Diego with the Canada Institute. So there's big shout out to Chris Sands at the Canada Institute as well. But since the entry into force of the USMCA, which of course replaced NAFTA on July 1st, 2020, both Ambassador Wayne and Diego released a report that revealed that the trade of goods and services has soared by 50%. Investment has increased 136% in the region. It has boosted the creation of jobs. It has, cemented certainty, increased competitiveness vis-a-vis other trading blocs around the world. And yet, within this success, a lot of challenges remain. And with the incoming U.S. administration and with the announcements of tariffs that we've just heard in the last couple of weeks, there is a real question sort of surrounding North American integration, about free trade, nearshoring, and also, of course, this under the upcoming 2026 USMCA review process, which for the last couple of years, I think everyone was trying to focus on the fact that it was a review and not a renegotiation, and I think that's up in the air. So we have our experts to explain all this to us. We'll start with Diego? All right, wonderful. Thank you, Diego.
Thank you, Lila, for your leadership, and as well, Virginia and Maria. It's such an honor to be writing something with Ambassador Wayne. Every chance I get, I learn a lot. I wanted to pick up some of the common threads from David's presentation before I get into the numbers. I agree completely. I think one of the key messages that need to come out from this booklet is that a prosperous Mexico is to the benefit of the U.S. A prosperous, competitive, and a Mexico with a cleaner energy matrix is what would make the U.S. more competitive vis-a-vis China, vis-a-vis Russia, and other trading blocs. And the other thing is business certainty is one of the nearshoring enablers, but as well is the key that will unlock Mexico's potential to attract more investment and more manufacturing production. Without business certainty, it's going to be very difficult for Mexico. We're going to keep running to this story that Mexico is a country that never fills its potential, and business certainty is key for that. Lila gave a really good just background. As she said, USMCA was implemented under a very complex geopolitical context, right in the middle of the pandemic. Then it came Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But despite that, USMCA has delivered remarkable results. As Lila was saying, USMCA created almost 1 million jobs for the U.S. economy. Like, these are USMCA-related jobs. Those are jobs supported by exports of goods and services from the U.S. to Mexico and Canada. And the ideal scenario is that we continue on this positive trajectory, and we still continue to prioritize the long-term benefits of economic integration of this project that we started 40 years ago. And the benefits are so good that not just now, but in 2 years, we should have that in mind whenever we sit down on the table and the countries will decide whether to extend or not the agreement. I don't want to go over all the chapter, although it's very short, but I think the key takeaways here, as we were saying at the beginning, is our economies are deeply intertwined. There's no other relationship that impacts more lives in the U.S. that its ties with Mexico and vice versa. Number two, full implementation of USMCA is crucial for a seamless review in 2026. Mexico has its compliance issues, as David was mentioning, but the U.S. also has some compliance issues. There was an auto panel that the U.S. lost. I ran the numbers this morning. It's been 722 days since the U.S. lost that panel, and they haven't announced how they're going to go back into compliance, either like the present administration and the next administration. So if there are compliance issues, it's going to be more difficult to have a successful review. Number three, USMCA is not an all-encompassing solution. USMCA has done great under the current context, but it won't fix some of these, like both Mexico's and the U.S. structural problems. For example, if the formal economy, if the Mexico does not create more incentives for the formal economy to grow, it is going to be very difficult for USMCA to create more of those well-paying, highly productive jobs. And number four, inaction or playing politics hurt our long-term prospects. We've been hearing a lot from our Canadian friends. I'm not trying to diss them, but I was a little surprised of all the conversations that we've been hearing as of lately, looking at it from a Mexican perspective. I think one of the messages there is that, again, our long-term strategic benefits of keep trading and integrating are so much bigger and better than just the day-to-day politics. So I would urge our leadership to look beyond politics and try to look at what we're getting out of this agreement. And lastly, we're here for the long run, as David was saying as well. The plants in Mexico, the pipelines between Mexico and the U.S., they're not going to move anywhere. So we might as well commit to this project that we started 30 years ago. And I think all the proposals that we get either from the next administration and also during the USMCA review should reflect that long-term vision. Because, as I said, we're here for the long run.
And so just to build on what Diego was saying, we come up with a number of recommendations in this policy. And that means we have to have a very serious review in 2026 of what's been going well and what has not been going so well. Going well has been a lot of the growth. It's been a tremendous amount of growth that everybody can look at. Secondly, what's not going well is the competition between the three countries as they're looking forward. And that includes U.S. compliance with USMCA. And this is going to be a difficult issue because the United States wants to be able to influence that compliance. It wants to be able to produce more input under USMCA. And that's going to be a tough issue to talk through with the government of Mexico, and they're going to have to deal with that. We're going to have to deal with regulatory harmonization as we go forward. We're now getting to that point where that's going to make a big difference. There's the whole issue of Mexico's constitutional reforms. They've been undertaking a number of these independent, really, of USMCA. They've started to adjust a few things recently and say they need to have some of this look like it's consistent with USMCA, but we'll see whether it is or not, and we'll have to have that discussion. We're we really are going to have a very serious discussion about China's influence and what this means for North American cooperation. This is going to be a really very serious discussion as we have this review. China is quite willing to take over many parts of many markets around the world, if it can, in order to expand its own growing sale of goods, its growing sale of influence, and its ability to purchase raw materials from around the world. And they will be happy to do that in Canada, the United States, or Mexico in particularly, as this goes forward. So we're going to have a very serious discussion of that. And the Mexicans have a big decision to make about how they're going to treat China in doing this. Now, right now, they seem to be leaning toward the part of saying, no, we're going to choose the United States and Canada. We'll see. We'll have to turn that into reality. There are a number of different parts of USMCA that will need to be adapted to really reinforce all of this going forward, and that includes what infrastructure looks like across North America. So there'll have to be a lot of decisions made about infrastructure development that aren't really part of USMCA, but they go along with that. And so right now, a lot of that discussion has been going on under the Commerce Department in the United States, working with their counterparts in other parts of both governments looking forward. So all of this is going to have to come together as in part of this broad discussion of USMCA and where we see it going. But before we get there, President Trump has said, well, I think we should talk at first about whether or not we're really ready to do that. Do we really have an approach to migration that's consistent with that? Do we have an approach to dealing with organized crime that's consistent with that? And I'm going to put a few restrictions maybe on Canadian and Mexican exports to the United States unless it's pretty clear that they're working seriously on these other issues. Now, that is not consistent with USMCA to do that, but it is consistent with his interpretation of his powers working under executive authority that exists in the United States. So that, in part, is going to be really the test over the first year to see, are both governments moving in that direction? Now, so far, both of them said, we're going to move in that direction, and they're taking steps to move in that way because you aren't going to get to the real discussion about the economic benefit of that unless you first deal with these other problems that are coming forward. So there's a lot that's out there, a lot to be dealt with. It's going to be a very complex discussion going forward, and there'll be a lot of hard decisions to make on where we go with USMCA. But before we even get to that USMCA decision-making, we're going to have to deal with some of these preliminary discussions about migration and about organized crime. So we'll talk about that, and then we'll come back.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Diego, and thank you, Ambassador Wayne. And, you know, at the Mexico Institute and, of course, with the Canada Institute, we will continue to work on North American issues. Diego will be spearheading a USMCA task force that already has been put into motion, and so a lot of publication reports and events will be coming in the next few months. I do want to jump in very quickly to discuss security. Again, Vanda's not here with us today, so I will just offer a few comments on her chapter, and I will ask Ambassador Wayne to do so as well. We are going to be publishing a much longer piece that Vanda wrote that delves into much more detail in terms of what we can expect for the future of U.S.-Mexico security cooperation. But in discussing these issues with Vanda, and upon reading her longer piece and the chapter that she wrote for this booklet, I think there is a glimmer of hope in terms of the future of U.S.-Mexico security cooperation. Sometimes we don't see the light at the end of the tunnel and on other issues on the U.S.-Mexico bilateral agenda. And while there are some similarities that were presented under President Sheinbaum's security plan that, you know, are comparable to what former President López Obrador did, especially so in terms of using social programs and using, resources and money to help vulnerable families and youth that, are vulnerable to organized crime in high crime areas. I think that the two pillars, the last two pillars of Sheinbaum's new security strategy offer opportunity for better engagement with U.S. security agencies. And that is, of course, strengthening intelligence and investigation capabilities and strengthening cooperation and coordination among all levels of government in Mexico. And so I think that these two last pillars, of course, are, offering sort of a hand to the United States in terms of what it can do. I think it is interesting that when they did present, and by they, I mean President Claudia Sheinbaum and her Security Secretary, Omar Garcia Harfuch, when they presented this new strategy, they never really mentioned the United States. It was kind of a real big omission. And I think that was more geared towards an internal domestic audience. I think from speaking to various U.S. authorities, there is some hope, and Ambassador Wayne, you were with me, so you can be my witness on this. There is cautious optimism. There is some cautious optimism that the way that Omar Garcia Harfuch collaborated with U.S. agencies while he was Security Secretary in Mexico City for then Mayor Claudia Sheinbaum provides, a positive outlook for what this can look like. That said, one of the sort of ongoing proposals of Claudia Sheinbaum's new security strategy is to continue strengthening the National Guard under the Ministry of Defense, which I guess now is only called Defense. Of course, with the constitutional reform, that is officially now, National Guard is officially operating under the Ministry of Defense in Mexico, and that, I think, provides several challenges going forward for the future of U.S.-Mexico security cooperation, because there's going to have to be more military-to-military engagement and sort of places restraints on what traditional U.S.-Mexico security cooperation looks like on that front. So that is sort of the context. I think sort of some of the things that the U.S. and Mexico will have to work on just at the very start is going to be to reestablish and rebuild mutual trust between agencies on both sides of the border. One of the recommendations that actually Vanda, in my opinion, rightfully points to is to expand the presence of U.S. law enforcement agents in Mexico. And that is because, I think that's what she's alluding to, right before President Biden took office in 2021, former President Lopez Obrador passed a reform to the national security law in Mexico that really limited the activity of foreign agents operating on Mexican soil. A very clear sign to the Biden administration that all security cooperation, or most of security cooperation, would be limited and had to be reported to the Ministry of Foreign Relations in Mexico and others. It was sort of a clear distancing in terms of what the U.S. and Mexico could achieve going forward. There were several incidents that Vanda goes into as well in her longer paper that really deteriorated U.S.-Mexico security cooperation, from the detention of General Cienfuegos to Lopez Obrador and his government, eliminating a financial intelligence unit of the DEA and then taking away a parking space that they had for a plane that the DEA used for counter narcotics operations. We had the Culiacanazo, which led to the release of Ovidio Guzman, which was provided by intelligence from the United States because of the violence that happened from his arrest. He was then released, then later detained. So there was a clear deterioration, right? And of course, one cannot forget the arrest of the Mayo Zambada in the United States. And so how Mexico's security cooperation goes forward is really going to be based, in my opinion, on reestablishing mutual trust, and really understanding what the mutual challenges and what the mutual objectives are, right? Of course, in 2021, we have now the bicentennial framework that replaced the 2007 Merida Initiative, and it lays out 3 primary goals. That said, there needs to be metrics, indicators that measure, right, the clear deliverables of what was said that was going to be done under the bicentennial framework. But again, I think the results of the last 6 years were less than one would expect. I think there were minimal, and I think there's lots to do. And for the next U.S. president, the focus will be on fighting organized crime and on reducing the flow of drug trafficking, particularly fentanyl, to the United States. And so I think there's a lot of work that can be done. And I think a positive sign, although really it doesn't solve the issue at large, there has been reports and information coming from Mexico that a lot of fentanyl has been seized in the last week or two. So that's at least a positive sign that the Mexican government is sort of reacting quickly to what we can expect from the incoming U.S. administration. But Ambassador Wynne, you've worked much more closely from the U.S. side on these issues and in Mexico as well, so happy to hear your thoughts.
Well, only to say, I agree fully with all that you said, except what we really went through was a period of deterioration in bilateral cooperation between the United States and Mexico over the past several years. And part of this is direct and part of this is indirect. And what we need to get back to is very close cooperation. Even if you don't like each other, you got to talk to each other very frankly about what you think is going on and sorting that out. And I think that hasn't been happening more broadly in the broad U.S.-Mexico dialogue. And I think there's a chance to do that with Claudia Sheinbaum because I think she is serious about slowing down the drug trafficking growth that's taken place in Mexico. And it has taken place through two large cartels, Sinaloa and then the Jalisco cartel. And they've been able to actually grow their approach to selling things into the U.S. market and to developing their ties with China and bringing things in and developing drugs in Mexico, then sending those to the United States. So that's a big challenge. We really have to just admit it and be quite open about it and seriously work to reduce that. And President Trump has made that one of the two prerequisites for getting going in a serious USMCA discussion. He said, okay, I'm happy to have this discussion about USMCA, but first, let's figure out what we're doing with all these drugs that are coming in, and secondly, what are we doing with all these migrants that are coming in? Now, we get to talk about both of those a little bit later. But we actually get to talk about them right up front. Right now, he's looking for Mexico and Canada, but Mexico to deliver, show that it's serious on these issues. If it's serious, then we'll get into a discussion of USMCA also. We won't solve everything immediately, I think, but we will get this dialogue going. If it's not serious, we won't get it going. So that's sort of where we are. What Vonda does is she lays out what we need to do. It's very much worth looking through everybody, the different areas that she identifies at the end of her paper, especially for what needs to be done. I think that is very useful. It has, a lot of it involves China, what we do vis-a-vis China. A lot of it involves the criminal cartels in Mexico. Then a lot of it involves what we do on both sides of the border, how the United States can help Mexico, and indirectly, how Mexico can thus help the United States. And I think that's pretty interesting going forward. And so I do recommend everybody take a careful look at this short version and then get to look at her longer version if you're more interested in doing that. But there's a pathway there where we can get back to close cooperation. And President Trump, in his own way, has sort of laid out, here's his pathway. You might not like it, but I'd like to see some results from this before we get going in the USMCA, which you really care about. And so we'll see where that gets to go. I hope they all go forward and we get to develop serious dialogues in all of these areas going forward. I mean, that's more of our view as the Mexico Institute. We'd like to see a serious dialogue taking place, but it's not clear yet whether that's going to happen. There is one path that leads to a lack of serious engagement and a lack of improvement in relations. There's another path. I mean, there are several paths, but then there are other paths that increasingly get to better engagement. So that's, I hope, where we'll get. And I hope we can have very frank and serious discussions about all these issues, the issues where we agree, and there are a number of issues where we really do agree if we can get people talking. And then there's some issues that will be really hard because the U.S. will ask for too much in some areas, and Mexico won't want to give so much, and that they'll be back and forth. But there's all these different degrees where you can move over the next several years in developing this collaboration and cooperation. And I hope we get to collaboration and cooperation again, which we've approached at various times in our history, but we've gone back, and we've certainly gone backward over the past several years. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Yeah, and I too would urge everybody to take a look at Vanda's chapter. She does really offer such a nuanced view as well of the fentanyl trade and how it operates with the cartels on the ground, with Mexican pharmacies, and she delves into an array of the illicit activities that organized crime groups in Mexico are involved in. So we were just trying to provide some context and some feedback of how the Mexico Institute hopes to engage with Mexico and the U.S. on security going forward. But as all of you could probably have noticed by now, there is no single issue on the bilateral agenda that doesn't naturally overlap with the other. And it is very true that President-elect Donald Trump has made it very clear that a lot of the tariffs, right, the 25% tariffs will depend as well on Mexico reducing drug trafficking and fighting organized crime. And in 2019, when he had first threatened to impose tariffs, it was tied to migration, right, which had a clear reaction from the Mexican government back then of sending thousands of its National Guard troops to both of its borders, leading to a decline in detentions and encounters at the U.S.-Mexico border. And so Julia and Ernesto, you will be talking to us about the other really, really big issue on the bilateral agenda, and that's migration. I think we all are aware that President-elect Donald Trump plans to, push forward with mass deportations. Interestingly enough, around, and you will correct me if I'm wrong, 11.3 million undocumented migrants in the United States, just slightly above 5 million are Mexican. And so if we're talking about mass deportations, there will be a really big chunk of Mexican nationals probably involved in those expulsions. And I know he's discussed first starting off with those that have a criminal background. I think we discussed in the various meetings we've had this week, Ernesto, about between 400 and 600,000 undocumented migrants in the United States have some kind of criminal background. So really interested to hear your thoughts, Julia. I know that you offer in a very, very concise way sort of some history about immigration patterns and trends in the past. And so a lot of this is not new. So eager to hear your thoughts, and thank you so much for being an author of this booklet.
Okay, well, thank you for the opportunity and the discussions, and in listening to and thank you to Lila and the other panelists, and listening to all of these topics. There's no one of these topics that's not related to migration in some way, that migration patterns don't impact, and that don't impact migration patterns. It's sort of a serendipitous moment for me to be here today, because just yesterday afternoon I taught the last session of a class I've taught all semester called Crime and Justice on the Border. And it was about the history of the creation of the border and the policing of the border leading up to the present day. And I had a group of 31 wonderful undergraduates who now have a final project assignment to suggest policies that can address and fix issues at the border. So we have young, very young minds at work on this, and I think this is what we need. I haven't, unfortunately, I haven't gotten their submissions yet. They're hard at work right now. But so there are sort of two things that came up in that class and that I think are really important. One is when I started out, I said, okay, we're talking about this issue during an election season, and what you're going to hear is you're going to hear a lot of simplistic promises and statements from politicians and from the media. You're going to hear people proposing really simplistic solutions, and I hope by the end of this semester you can think about this in a more nuanced way, and you can think about more nuanced, complex solutions. The other thing is, I hope, and this is my sort of, as a historian, what do I hope for the future? I hope that we can begin to have more honest discussions about migration. And throughout at least the 20th century, our experience with migration and migration from Mexico has really been shaped by the lack of honest discussions, particularly about our demand in the United States for migration. So throughout the 20th century, we've engaged in repeated cycles of migration and deportation with Mexican migrants. We have encouraged, sometimes recruited Mexican migrants to come to the United States because there's been such a demand for their labor. And then, sometimes at the same time, sometimes subsequently, we have criminalized, even demonized Mexican migrants as invaders, as criminals, as people who are stealing opportunities. Some of those moments, I'm sure you're familiar with them, but in the 1920s, we begged Mexican migrants to come here, to come and fill agricultural labor, railroad labor. In the 1930s, after the economic downturn of the 30s, we turned around and began mass deportations. So when we talk about mass deportations, this is not the first time. The same thing, the same pattern repeated itself in the 1940s and then the 1950s, and the same pattern has repeated itself continuously since the 1970s. So this cycle of migration and deportation really reflects our failure to have honest discussions about our demand for migration. And there's an image in my mind that I saw once, I've never been able to find since, of a wall along the border and with two signs on it. One sign saying, employees needed, inquire within, and then the other one saying, no trespassing, keep out. Right, so we've had always this sort of schizophrenic rhetoric about migration, and particularly about migration across the southern border. And then the second sort of area of dishonesty, and one that I spoke with my students about all semester long, is this idea, this false idea, that we can address migration, address security issues at the border, and specifically address them by focusing on border security, on policing the border, the actual physical border, and then on these policies, the D policies, detention, deportation, and deterrence, right? That we can solve these problems through these policies. And we've also seen, especially since the 1965 period, but also before then, these efforts to solve the problem, and this is where I would sort of underscore those simplistic solutions, really at the border or through these kind of mass deportation or building walls, rather than creating a system that, again, acknowledges that we need those lower wage or so-called unskilled workers, which I don't think should be called unskilled workers, that provides openings for those migrants that we need and that need to come here. So, and also rather than having any kind of discussion about the root causes, the push factors of migration, which we talked about some in the booklet. So I would argue, and I argued to my students, and I think that they agreed with me by the end of the semester, that sort of dishonesty, those simplistic narratives are why we're in the situation that we're in today. It's why our immigration system, that people on both sides of the aisle agree that our immigration system is broken, that it doesn't match the demands of our economy, nor does it match the needs and demands of migrants. That's why we have people trying to come in via asylum, why asylum is now somehow really the only legal mechanism for low-wage, for low-skilled workers to come into the United States. So I hope that we can begin to have, so that is my hope, I think, for the new administration, is that we can begin to have more honest conversations about how to create legal paths for low-wage, unskilled migration, particularly from the Western Hemisphere, from Mexico, how we can solve the problems beyond the border, right? Not just by pouring resources, money into securitizing the border, but by dealing with demand here and root causes in the sending countries. And also how we can create a fair system, right? Not a system that's open borders, but one that offers opportunity and that also considers that a country should have the right to patrol and police its borders and to maintain security within its borders. And I would just point at actually, my employer, the U.S. Catholic Church, I work at Catholic University, so they have articulated a stance, the U.S. Catholic bishops have articulated a stance on migration that I think is fairly nuanced, and it basically says that we're required to welcome the stranger, right? It's part of our belief system that we welcome the stranger, and particularly people who immigrate who are in need, but at the same time that a country has the right to secure its borders and to establish security within its borders. So it's nuanced. It's not simple. It's going to require these sort of nuanced, creative solutions, which I am looking forward to receiving from my students when they submit their final papers. And it's going to require honest discussions and honest acknowledgement of the demand that we have here for those workers in our economy. The last thing I'll just simply say is that I found the recent interaction or communication between Trump and President Sheinbaum very interesting because, this was a sort of, once again, like the social media communications that Trump released where he said, I'm going to institute the 25% tariffs. Well, then he had a conversation with Trudeau, and then he had a conversation with Sheinbaum. And then he, I don't know if it was a tweet or a Truth Social, but then he released again a statement. He said, well, I had a really good conversation with President Sheinbaum, and she's gonna secure the border. Okay, simplistic. Then he said, I also talked with her about demand. And I'm gonna go and we're gonna really look at the issue of demand. And so I showed that to my students, and I was like, it's working, right? Where this is actually a really interesting moment if there's an opening to have an honest conversation about demand. I don't know. That's a lot to take out of one social media post, but we can maybe have a little bit of, why not have a little bit of hope?
Ernesto?
Thank you, Julia. First of all, good afternoon, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much, Lila, for the invitation to collaborate on this short document. I want to say that Lila and Maria Calderon in the back and Virgilia Bullington were fantastic editors, and they got a lot of the credit for this getting done on time. The idea was floated before the elections, but we had to get the booklet out in time for this event. So it was a collective effort that I'm happy that you have the booklet in front of you for the ones here, and the ones online you can get the pieces also on the website for free with slide additions, specifications, additional footnotes, and all that is a slightly living document. And these are just ideas to put out there to start a conversation. So first of all, it's a short chapter, so I recommend you read it. Julia gave a very general context about it. I'm going to talk about the recommendations. So in the first 3-4 pages, we talk a little bit about the history and some pointers to ground this discussion. That is very complex, and indeed, as Julia is saying, is very simplified in the media for obvious reasons, but for good policy making, we have to understand it a little better. And then contrary to what we often hear, actually, I would argue that grading or doing better immigration policy is actually not that hard. The situation is pretty easy, and a lot of it is, there is indeed labor demand in the U.S. There's people looking for jobs or escaping conflict in other countries, and there's a compromise that can be met, parties in the middle where both can benefit. So the first series of recommendations are that this issue is indeed a regional issue. It's not something that the U.S. can fix alone. And we understand the rhetoric of America first and putting the interests of the U.S. first. But even the Trump and his intuition of these threats to start a discussion with Mexico and Canada, with Trudeau and Sheinbaum, he knows, right? He understands that he needs Mexico to cooperate in order for this to work. He intuited that. He did that in 2019, as Lila was saying. So that's a correct understanding. The U.S. cannot truly do this alone. This is something that people are coming from other places, and Mexico and increasingly the U.S.-Canada border playing an important role of people getting to the U.S.-Mexico border, which is what the current or the coming administration doesn't want. So agreeing with our colleagues, for a while during the Obama years, for example, there was indeed a haphazard North American way to deflect Central American migration. It's the time when we saw the crisis of the unaccompanied minors. And again, it was very shocking in the media to have all these young people, mainly 14, 15, 16-year-olds, coming from Central America, and then because of U.S. laws, they had to be allowed in, and they had to be put in protections, temporary shelters for them. So there was, it was very attention-grabbing in the media, and it needed a quick deployment of resources, which is something that grabs a lot of negative attention to immigration. So then, at the same time, Obama was under the pressure from Republicans in order to get to comprehensive immigration reform to deport large numbers of people, which the administration did. And part of that, it was not welcoming too many people that could be joining the ranks of the undocumented. So there was a big incentive to not allow adult Central Americans, which was the largest number of people coming at a time that Mexican migration had lulled following the 2008 crisis. Canada was doing the same on the quiet, but they were also making it harder for Central Americans to get asylum and to reach the Canadian border, which is more difficult without a visa. But Mexico was also copying the idea of the United States and trying to deter Central Americans, not only from staying or asking for asylum, that was very rare, but also in a way, little by little, to try to make it harder for the people to reach the U.S. border through the Grupo Beta, through immigration groups, to ways that were first could be also seen as assistance to help them, but also in a way was a little bit of a deterrence mechanism. But the way I think about it is like, so North America is an important region that we're talking about here, and I think it's the right unit of analysis, as my colleagues have shown. But but Canada was doing its thing on its own, Mexico was doing its own thing, and U.S. was doing its own thing, and they were all hoping that the people, Canada and Mexico were hoping that the people would come to the U.S. to stay, and the problem was solved for them. It was just a transit issue. But the U.S. was also reflecting and needed Mexico to take back a lot of these people. So the way I often talk is imagine these balloons that clowns inflate in a kid's party that are long, like a hot dog. And then if it's partly inflated and you squeeze in the U.S. and you push the air, it's going to go to Canada and to Mexico, right? If you push into Mexico, it's going to go north and all that. But the air, which is people on the move, not because they want to, but because you're a youth, your parents live in the U.S., you want to live with them again after 14 years not seeing them. You are back in the day in El Salvador. They were trying to recruit you for a gang. So in order to survive, you have to move, or Ukraine, Afghanistan. People are moving not because they want to. And it's only 3.5% of the global population that are living in a country different than their own. So this is an exception. This is a minority amount of people, but once they accumulate in a border, they become very visible. So again, you cannot get rid of the air because we're talking about human beings. Some of them die on the way in the Mediterranean, in the desert, etc. But many of them are going to survive. So this pushing, okay, go to Canada, go to Mexico, go to the U.S. is not sustainable, right? But that was how it worked for many years. North America, as three different countries, were not able to address this and manage it in a smart way because they were not acting regionally. That was a failed opportunity because then later came the Afghans, the Ukrainians, the Venezuelans, the Haitians, other countries facing economic, political, social crisis, Cuba, looking for a way north, looking for a way to the United States. And then early on, Mexico was facilitating the caravans to arrive into the border in the U.S. to ask for entry. And as Lila was saying, Trump started or maybe realized this dream that other people had. Fox, when he came into power in 2000 with George W. Bush, they started talking about this shared responsibility, that Mexico had the right, it was natural for Mexico to advocate for the nationals in the U.S., and that's something that the two governments could talk and work together, and that was better than just pretend that the Mexico government didn't exist and they couldn't do anything about it. It's harder for the U.S. to achieve those goals. So this cooperation was talked about. Things happened. Then with Obama also he had a little bit of that discourse of regional cooperation, but it was very thin. And it was Trump in the first administration with that visit to Mexico and that commitment from the Mexican government that actually started a very strong cooperation, continued on drugs, but also on migration because of the threat on tariffs. So then later we have Remain in Mexico, that again, it's the creation of temporary refugee, without being refugee officially, shelters in the Mexican border towns while they had a paper note and it's like, hey, it's Juan's turn to come and ask for asylum. Okay, it's Maria's turn to go up front and ask for asylum. It was a very haphazard way. The Trump administration came up with CBP-1 in order to organize this a little bit. Not enough numbers for the amount of demand of people asking for asylum, but it was a way to organize this flow and make it more orderly, which is what a lot of the parties were demanded. So what I'm trying to say here is because this is a series of recommendations for the Trump administration did these successes in the first time in the sense that it consciously or unconsciously recognized that it needs Mexico to work with this. It also, by the administration, they deported a number of Chinese people that were undocumented here. It needed China to take that airplane. There's been ups and downs with Venezuela, whether they will take refugees or not. With Cuba, you need cooperation. For a long time, the U.S. only had immigration agreements with Cuba, which was, there were the embargoes, there were not embassies, but they had an immigration agreement. So we recommend and remind the incoming Trump administration that in order for them to be successful on migration control, they have to work with Mexico, work with Canada, work with Central American countries, have avenues of communication with Haiti, Cuba, Venezuela. And also there's tools that are available that the Biden administration put into place, the Los Angeles Declaration. But there's a lot there that it's a framework of international responsibility for managing immigrants. And one of the key things that hopefully the Trump administration doesn't lose, because it's to the benefit of the U.S. interests and to the benefit of what the U.S. wants to do, which is decrease the number of undocumented migrants arriving to the border, the number of asylum seekers arriving to the border. And the solution that the Los Angeles Declaration proposes is that Colombia, Chile, Argentina, Mexico will take in more people and render them asylum seekers in those countries with a path to citizenship with labor rights. And we were having a discussion yesterday and last night with friends and partners of the Wilson Institute of different government initiatives in the Istmo de Tehuantepec, with nearshoring. A lot of interesting developments in Mexico are going to need labor force that is not there because Mexico is aging too. So the solution to this, so yes, we have the challenges of energy laws and trade agreements, but also Mexico will need more people to make this reality of nearshoring happening. So the fact that there's Guatemalans, Salvadorians willing to move to southern Mexico, which is much closer, easier, familiar to them than coming to northern U.S. or Canada, is a solution for the U.S. goals and is a solution for Mexico, and it will help this integration of the North American region, which, as we saw during the pandemic, is much better than depending on things coming from across the Atlantic or from China far away. So to summarize, I'll talk briefly about a couple of other points we talk about here.
Go ahead.
Ernesto,
Or we'll stop.
let's stop
Okay.
there. The only reason being is to
Yes.
provide, I'm sure a lot of what the recommendations say will probably be brought up in some of the questions. But I do want to offer the opportunity, and we'll start off with the in-person guests, to ask a question to our authors. Yes. Can we get Isa the mic over here? Thank you. If you can just present yourself and say where you're coming from, that would be fantastic.
Rafael Bernal with the Hill newspaper. Should be a brief one. Mexico and Canada, for internal reasons, both seem to be falling into the trap of Donald Trump pitting them against each other in these negotiations. Do you have any expectations that either Sheinbaum or Trudeau or potentially Trudeau's successor will be able to sort of navigate around that challenge?
Sure.
I guess I could say, I think that talking to Mexicans and Canadians, they each see that they need to get to a position where they can negotiate together with the United States. That's not the position they're being offered right at the moment, but I think they will try to move in that direction. Now, it's a little harder to do with somebody who's not in government yet, but they will have to get there. And I think that from their perspective would be a much wiser thing to do. From a U.S. perspective, you could debate which one is the wiser thing to do. But I think if you want to get an overall agreement on to how to handle this problem going forward, and there is a migration problem in both countries, in Mexico and in Canada, you do need agreement on rules, on order on how you would handle that. So there is an argument for bringing everybody together, I think, in dealing with that. That will probably follow both sides saying, yes, we want to work with you on this. Let's do so as North America.
And if I may add something real quick, I think there's a very big difference between what the private sector in Canada is thinking of USMCA and what some politicians are saying about very loudly. And Mexico and Canada have been on this position before. This is not the first time we did this in 2018, and I think the divide and conquer strategy didn't work then, and I hope that it's not going to work now because, as I said, we're stronger together. And for the two smaller parties, it makes a lot more sense to work together in order to have a successful rebalancing of some of the concessions of the agreement.
And I think Mexico and Canada together have more leverage now when they actually work together. So, yes, Heidi.
Hi, my name's Heidi Smith. I'm a professor in Mexico City at the Universidad Iberoamericana. David, it's nice to see you. I worked on the Energy and Climate Partnership of the Americas years ago, and so I have two questions for you. One is specifically on transmission across Texas and Mexico. That was one of the big things ECPA was supposed to function and run and help the Texan energy grid, and I'm curious of how that's evolved. And then I would love to hear a deep dive on the CRE, the CRE, the Comisión Reguladora Energética, and I'm curious if we can think, or what would be your lessons learned, what didn't function with our creation of these capital markets and regulating energy? Was it a labor issue? Was it a communications structure? Or was it just trying to evolve? What went wrong, I guess, with our approach on really deconcentrating the electrical and the regulatory agencies of energy? And then one last question on INL's work, working subnationally. What is your take, Leila or Ambassador Wayne, on these actions? Is para-diplomacy and these security frameworks feasible or flexible, or is it encouraged or not?
Thank
so
you.
much.
Thank you, Heidi. Why don't we take one more question because we're probably going to have to close in about, what time is it? Oh, we still have like 7 minutes. Okay. Maybe one more
Close in
question?
7 minutes.
Yeah. No? Okay, I actually have some
Well,
questions.
Mari Carmen had a question.
Mari Carmen, okay, because I have some questions from the online audience as well. Hi, Mari Carmen.
Hello. Thank you very much. This is super interesting. Mari Carmen Marron with the Brookings Institution. So my question is, it seems like many of these issues have been very politicized, right? Crime, migration, et cetera, and the links to trade. And we're seeing a very good disposition from Mexico and Canada to have dialogue and to work things out with the U.S. And I'm wondering what you're seeing from the Trump administration or what we can expect in terms of that willingness to engage in this dialogue, or what are some incentives that could bring the new administration to have those dialogues? Thank you.
Thank you. So I'll just add one more, and this is for migration. So, and we can just sort of end the Q&A session there. There's a question from someone who I don't know the name, but is there any anticipation of humanitarian challenges resettling people in countries of origin from mass deportations? So we don't have to give in-depth answers to this. Heidi, we can speak, offline as well with David. So David, we'll start with you.
Sure. I don't know if I totally understood the first question, but at least electricity trade between Texas and Mexico seems to be going okay. It's really, there's not a regulatory issue there, and there's plenty of excess wind, so I think that's fine. It's not big, but it's fine. I think the issue with the CRE was not really, was not our fault. I mean, I think the fundamental problem is that the CRE is undercapitalized, and it has a lot of dirty, heritage, inefficient energy, and it has not figured out how to make the economics of the CFE work when most of the high-end, high-paying customers are self-supply. So the self-supply contracts that took place over time have the high-paying customers. And so what they did to preserve their old energy is, instead of giving equal dispatch or dispatch to the cheapest, most efficient energy first, which is what we do and what the energy forum required, they let CFE's energy go first, which destroyed the economics of all the renewables, all the renewable companies that won those elections. They essentially destroyed the business, and now they're permanently saying, we will decide who goes first. So there's no incentive to build new electricity if you're not guaranteed, priority and dispatch. So that's what it was. Actually was working. They never got to the point where they advanced the electricity market, same-day market, enough to pass those benefits on. But fundamentally, someone needs to recapitalize CFE before you can fix the political problem.
Thank you. Does anybody want to, Mari Carmen, someone want to tackle that question?
I can.
Yeah?
You can go first.
Okay. I think Mexico and Canada will have to take some preemptive actions, even before the inauguration and perhaps before the review, in order to have those frank conversations on other topics that are outside of the trade agenda. So without action on those, on security and immigration, I don't think we're going to be able to open up the conversation on other issues.
Right, so I think they'll be forced to come forward with some answers to that, which will be generally acceptable, and then hopefully they will be able to bring it together to have a three-way conversation. But my hunch is there will be bilateral conversations and a three-way conversation that ideally will go forward. But we'll just have to see, you know, how the United States, how the Trump administration decides to work it out. They may try to keep it to bilateral discussions, and we'll see what happens.
Mindful, that's how we got to USMCA. It was two bilateral conversations that ended up being a trilateral conversation that got us here.
Right.
I would just add very quickly to that, Mari Carmen, I think Mexico, and I can only speak to U.S.-Mexico, I'm not going to touch on Canadian politics. I think Mexico needs to come up with a grand bargain for the Trump administration. They need to come up with issues that they're actually willing to give, right, to the United States in return for something, right? A very clear quid pro quo. This is, I expect, a very transactional bilateral relationship, and I don't see a clear strategy coming from the Mexican government as of today as to what they're actually going to do, what they're actually going to offer Trump in return for something in return, right? So anyway, I just
They're
put that.
clearly moving in that
For sure.
direction.
Well, yeah, I
And
mean,
the
I think-
action in Sinaloa, for example, is clearly showing we can do something in Sinaloa to determine
Yeah.
the movement of drugs by the cartel, the Sinaloa cartel northward.
And-
What they do with that, we don't know yet, or what framework they're going to put that in, we don't know yet.
And I think that's where a lot of that's why I mentioned cautious optimism coming from, I mean, Claudia Sheinbaum has only been in power, right, for 2 and some months. But there's cautious optimism that her security strategy will render results and that her security secretary does know how to combat organized crime. So hopefully that will allow for a better negotiation process.
If I
And
could
then how
just
she
add on,
presents it to the United States.
That's right.
And to Canada, and how they have those discussions is yet to be determined.
Yeah, on the Trump personnel side, I would say early to tell. I mean, there are a lot of Floridians and Cuban Americans in the transition, and of course, Marco Rubio, but we don't have a senior director yet for Western Hemisphere. We don't have a nominee for Assistant Secretary for Western Hemisphere. And we don't really have a sense yet whether Marco Rubio's priorities are going to be migration and China or whether they're going to be ideology. My guess is they're going to be migration in China and not ideology. But you have, you know, Mauricio Claver-Carrón and Carlos Trujillo are sort of working on transition that would suggest an ideological bent. When we see those two appointments, I think we're going to be able to predict what policy is going to look like.
Ernesto, Julia, do you want to talk a little bit, just very briefly, on the humanitarian front?
Yes, that's a great question. So real quick, for a long time, policy discussions around migration have focused, as Julia was saying, on the working age man from Mexico coming undocumented, and whether you could stop him at the border or deport him. There were always some women and children coming, but that was not the main focus. And recently, Biden has implemented or done a lot of deportations, but mainly from people just arriving at the border. So the humanitarian issue comes in the reality of migration, that most people are settled in cities. They've been here for 20, 30 years. They're not sending remittances anymore. They pay taxes. They have jobs. They're part of communities. And they have families of U.S. citizen spouses and U.S. citizen children. So when you deport a parent, all the legal infrastructure says that it's in the best interest of the American child to live with a parent and to keep going to school and all that. So then when the person is removed from the interior, then all the neighbors, the churches, everybody writes letters to stop that. And that's when humanitarian case, the courts can do a lot with it, not to separate these families. That was very unpopular when it happened at the border last time. But if you remove families that have members that voted for Trump being here for a long time, that really caused a lot of humanitarian issues for a lot of American communities.
Thank you so much. Well, with that, we have come to a close for the launch of our booklet. Again, you have the printed version outside. Please take one. For those joining online, again, like I mentioned earlier, it is up and live and uploaded on our website. The Spanish translation of the booklet will be live in a few hours. We're just putting the same format as the English version, and we will continue to have these discussions, of course, at the Mexico Institute going forward. Thank you, everybody, for coming here today. I know it's cold, and I know the Ronald Reagan building had some issues with the entrance, so thank you for your patience, and my deep gratitude to the authors. I know we had to speed through this process a little bit, but you can only do it with real experts and subject matter experts. So thank you to each one of you, to each and every one of you, and thank you for those that aren't joining us here today, and more to come in the near future. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you.
Thank you, Lila.
Gracias.
No, a ti.